We've got the very important two sessions meetings, which are
Yes.
coming up in China. Policymakers around the world, especially here in the United States, will be looking very closely at these meetings. What are global CEOs hoping will come out of it?
Yeah, so this isn't just any two sessions, because this two sessions is going to be the two sessions, but it's also going to be the formal release of the next 5-year plan. And so what I think is really important to emphasize is that the global companies, global CEOs, care deeply about the state of the Chinese economy, right? The better the Chinese economy is doing, the better it is for everybody. The more efficient the Chinese economy is working, the more efficient it is for everybody. So I think the first thing they're going to be looking for is what signals are we getting about how the economy is going to be managed and what's the direction of the economy over the next year. So they might be looking at things like, what are we doing, say, on either stimulus, or what's going to happen with targets for demand or targets for inflation or deflation and those kind of things. So I think that's the first thing that they'll be looking for. I think the second thing they'll be looking for is, if you're a global business in China, the Chinese government often talks about how important it is to keep the door open for foreign investment. But companies are always worried that that door may be starting to close, because here and there is always examples of where there become new challenges that arise for foreign companies. That's not unique to American companies. You'll hear the same thing from European companies or from Japanese companies. And so, again, looking for clear signs that China remains open and encourages both foreign investment and wants foreign investors to come and prosper and be successful along with Chinese companies. I think maybe the third thing, which we'll be watching for, is, again, is where is China going on the broader regulatory front? There are lots of issues that have been raised with the Chinese government, and issues that the Chinese government has surfaced itself as challenges for foreign investors. And do we see concrete steps being taken to follow through on some of the planned and announced reforms? So I'd say those are the big three.
Right. So China has in the past, in fact over the last few years, given the undertaking that it is opening up, as it puts it. It's opening up its economy. It wants more investment. So you will be looking closely at investment opportunities that will come out of these two sessions.
Yeah, so I think not just investment opportunities. This is a place where I think we've had some very fruitful discussions with the Chinese government.
Yeah.
I remember the Chinese government talking about, here are the ways that we have opened over the last period of time. And then when we talk to companies, foreign companies, they don't feel that. And so often, if you're a policymaker, there are steps that you take that you think may be affecting and improving the business climate, but it's not felt by the companies, meaning it doesn't translate into actual practice. Or, sometimes national level practice may not be fully implemented at the local level. And so that's what I mean by saying it's absolutely clear that the goal of the Chinese government is to open up. But often it requires a lot more than just national level policy or regulations to really affect it, that opening up. And that's what they'll be looking for, is, are we going to be seeing even more efforts to take this national vision of opening up and implement it down to the local level and elsewhere, so that, in fact, it's not just a goal that's opening up, but it's something that's felt by global companies and global investors.
Well, let's look at some of the sectors where there are opportunities for greater cooperation, a win-win strategy, as China puts it. Let's take green energy technologies. Here is a sector where China is leading in the world right now. It's the world's biggest producer of green technologies, things like wind power, solar power as well. It's the biggest exporter as well. Where do you see cooperation between the two countries in this particular sector? Yeah, no,
China's absolutely the world leader in this, and there is no decarbonization without some China component of that strategy. What I hear from, say, American utility companies is that China's done a lot of innovations in things like smart grid management, rapid power generation, power storage, and all of those things. And those are all areas that I think the U.S., as we try and grow the electricity supply and power generation capacity in the United States, I think that's a case where if the U.S. is going to do that fast, it needs to do it with, it's going to have Chinese products, Chinese equipment, and maybe China expertise. So absolutely building out energy infrastructure is one of those areas that's really important.
These two countries are the two biggest economies in the world. How would you characterize the trade and economic relationship between the two countries and the current state of trade relations?
Yeah, I want to sort of tug on that, because I think that if you just say they're the two biggest economies, you're missing the most important part. It's not just that they're the two biggest economies, they're the two most dynamic economies and the two most innovative economies. And it's when you add the innovation piece and the dynamism piece that you really recognize the need for the two countries to find ways to work together together more effectively. And so what does that mean sort of in practice? I think what that means is, the best example for me right now is life science. I just saw a report that said globally, 37% of the new molecules, that's the highfalutin word they use to talk about new drugs, were developed in China. 37%. 5 years ago, 5%. And so China's ability to innovate and scale in drug discovery has really grown. And so that's definitely an area where we see interest on the part of Western companies and Chinese companies to leverage each other's strengths. Yeah. But also, that's a place where I think it's a safe space for governments to say, okay, we're talking about human lives. We're talking about, working on cancer or diabetes or these important things. That becomes a safe space where we think that there's really great opportunity for the two sides to work together. But again, it's not just the size of the economies, it's the innovation and dynamism that underpins those economies that make that kind of cooperation significant and useful.
Would it be fair to say then, Sean, that this is not really about competition, it's more about synergy?
It should be about synergy. But both sides, we still have a very intensely competitive relationship, right? I think one of the dominant themes between the two countries right now is we've got, on the U.S. side, you've got the U.S. trying to figure out how do we minimize potential Chinese leverage over the U.S. economy. That might be things like critical minerals and rare earths, or it might be in drugs or whatever. And we have the same concern on the Chinese side, trying to identify what are areas that the United States could potentially have leverage over our economy, and how do we eliminate that leverage. And so that kind of de-risking strategy absolutely exists and is not going to really go anywhere. I think that's a dynamic that I think has now hit that unavoidable stage. So on top of this baseline of de-risking and trying to eliminate the other side's leverage, that's where you get the opportunities for synergy, right? And so you've got to look at the Venn diagram of where is it in the U.S. interest and capability, and where is it in the Chinese interest and capability without overlapping with national security. And that's absolutely where the corporate sector is looking for those areas where the U.S. and China can work together to deliver better outcomes, whether it's better outcomes for economic outcomes in China or the U.S., or health, or energy solutions, but that's absolutely the place that the corporate sector is.
Now, we have seen trade tensions between the United States and China.
That was quite the understatement.
Yes. I mean, they've ebbed and flowed, these trade tensions. Sometimes they've been very high, sometimes they've lowered. What do you think needs to be done to lower these trade tensions? Because corporations, businesses, they want certainty. Yeah. They want to know where their money is safe. They look to the future as well. So what needs to be done to create that kind of stability?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to this issue. The most important is, I think, for most companies, the biggest breakthrough that happened in Busan was only after Busan did we finally get a modicum of stability and predictability. And so obviously one of the big goals is to see how long can we keep this sort of in place so that companies can make these decisions. Is it safe to invest in production in China or the US or everywhere? So that's the biggest thing, is how do we get this to extend? And so I think what the corporates think is that where we've seen progress happen the most rapidly in the relationship is when you actually have the leader-to-leader level discussions. Often when it's done at a lower level, then I think both sides are much more cautious. It's only when the two leaders connect that they can express a vision, and then things can move forward. And so I think really, in the eyes of the business community, the most important milestones that will be coming up over the next year are the leader-to-leader engagements that give confidence and direction to people under them to continue to move forward, not just in a direction of stability, but to then find areas that you can work together so that we're not just keeping the relationship at the same low base level, but looking for ways to start to bring it back up. But leader-to-leader contact is by far the most important.
Yeah, and when we talk about trade tensions and what is happening, I mean, there is a perception that the two countries are moving away from each other, that companies are moving away from each other. We hear the D word, decoupling, all the time. But you say, no, that's not happening. In fact, what we are seeing is a deepening of ties.
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is, a couple of things. What we're not seeing is, I keep seeing this narrative that American companies are pulling out of China. The data does not support that. There's been virtually no companies pulling out of China except where tariffs have made business completely untenable. And so that's understandable. But everything else, no one is leading China. What we do see is we see two things. We see companies trying to make supply chains more resilient. And so the two things we see, in some cases, that means their Chinese customers, Chinese companies, need a more resilient supply chain. That means you increase your investment in China to give them greater security about that. But it also means that globally, you've got companies, Chinese companies and American companies often together going into third countries to create another node in the supply chain. So it's not just all China or not just North America, but you've got either North America plus one or China plus one. One of the most interesting parts of that, I think, is the automotive sector, where time and again, when I would see an American company investing somewhere outside of China in automotive, they would be going along with their Chinese counterparts. They'd be doing it together. Sometimes it was led by the US side, sometimes it was led by the Chinese side. But the fact that they were doing it together shows me just how entwined some of these networks are. And that's where I think companies are, is trying to have more stability, more resilient supply chains. But sometimes that's being done in companionship or in partnership with longstanding Chinese stakeholders.
Right, that brings me a point that you talked about in a speech last May. You offered an alternative to a very commonly held view that it's the US market alone that determines global business trends, that dictates that. How do you see Chinese business leaders, investors, entrepreneurs shaping this changing environment?
That is the most incredible misperception, I think, that's out there. It's undeniable that the largest consumer market in the world is the United States. But for many sectors, the largest market in the world is in China, right? So there are sectors where you've got US is the dominant market, and the places where China is. And I think the advantage you have as a company is, depending on what your sector is, you sort of are going to focus on where is your market, where is your supply chain, where is your platform. And so in some cases it means more investment in China, and other times it means more on the US side.
Now, China's goal is to modernize its healthcare system. So how can the two countries put their resources together, cooperate, and make this happen?
Yeah, I think China's progress in that area has been absolutely extraordinary. This has been a long-term initiative on the part of the Chinese government. What we've seen, though, despite all of the great progress, is that often sometimes it's difficult for the Chinese government to engage effectively with the private sector, especially the foreign private sector. And the foreign private sector often feels like it's challenging to engage with the Chinese government. So even though they've got shared goals on how do we modernize, say, healthcare treatment, or how do we better deal with elder care, often you need sort of a platform to help bring them together. That's what we tried to do, is to let government agencies, think tanks, and business all get together to talk about some of these issues, to look at ways that they can work better together and they can have better understanding.
What about things like governance, like regulatory innovation, like financing?
Yeah, that's important too. Obviously, companies, global companies deal with these issues around the world. And so, people think that if you've got a global life science or pharmaceutical company talking with the Chinese government, that maybe they're just talking about the US regulatory system. And sometimes they are. But often they'll do compare and contrast. Here's how it worked in Japan. Here's how it worked in Europe. Here's how it worked in Singapore. And that's something that the big global companies can bring. And that is a global perspective to see the different ways that some of these challenges of healthcare finance, healthcare regulation can be managed. Because there isn't any one model that's right for every place. But by being able to bring a number of examples, I think helps deepen the debate and deepen the understanding, and ultimately deliver better outcomes on the policy front, which helps us for what really matters, is how do you get better patient outcomes.
Right, so you adapted to the environment, to the situation on the ground.
Right, and that's what Chinese policymakers are really good at. Often what they need is, like everywhere, Chinese policymakers are busy. They can't necessarily go and spend a week in Singapore, then a week in France, then a week in Canada, and a week in the US. And so one way to shortcut through some of that is by working with global partners that operate in multiple markets, where you can have conversations about what are different solutions and how can they work. And that's just one of the ways that I think we try and bridge sort of this gap between policymaking and industry.
Sean, great having you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was an honor. I appreciate it.